Hey guys, what's up? It's Zyflin here, and today we're going to be talking about the status chance changes that were added into Warframe a few weeks ago. I wasn't able to cover this whenever they first came out because I had a pretty bad infection, but I'm over it now, and it turns out that it was worth the wait though, because there were changes made to impact procs and gas procs just today. In this video, we're going to be going individually through all of the status effects and talk about how they've changed due to the new stacking status changes. Before we move on though, if you could leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel to help it out and stay up to date and notified with all my Warframe content, I would really appreciate that. With all that being said though, let's talk about how status effects stack on enemies now. To demonstrate, I'm going to be using the Nagan Taka, a crossbow that primarily deals slash damage. In this modding section, I've equipped mods that increase the weapon status chance, status duration, and the likelihood to proc slash procs. I'm going to be shooting a level 165 Corrupted Heavy Gunner. Pay attention to the IPS symbols that appear above his health bar. These symbols indicate which status effects we've applied to the enemy. If you play Warframe before the status chance changes, you'll understand that that's normal. What's different is the fact that the status effects that you apply to an enemy now have a visible stacking number. In this example, I'm only proccing impact, puncture, and slash procs. My slash procs can stack pretty much indefinitely. The more slash procs I apply, the more damage over time I'm going to deal. However, if we look at impact and puncture procs, it's a different story. For our next test, I'm going to be using the Warframe to demonstrate how puncture procs are now handled. So puncture was one of the many status effects to be changed in the status chance changes. Puncture procs now reduce any damage dealt by enemies inflicted with the puncture proc by 30% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 10 times, leading to a total of 75% reduction in damage. Unfortunately, this isn't the best status effect in the game, simply because it doesn't really help you kill your enemy any faster. However, it can prove to be useful for players who die a lot, or for players who like to run tankier warframes like Valkyr while also running Adaptation, for example. The biggest downside of the puncture proc is the fact that for the enemy to deal 75% less damage, he has to constantly be inflicted by 10 puncture procs that are going to decay from the enemy if you give up shooting him with your puncture status weapon. But next we're going to test out the new impact procs using a Karak Wraith with a few 60/60 status mods equipped. So impact procs are still really annoying. For every impact proc you apply, the enemy is going to stagger. Once you hit 5 procs, the enemy is going to fall over, and on top of that, you also have an increased chance for a Parasol finisher opening. The impact status effect without a doubt was and still is the worst status effect in the game because you pretty much miss out in terms of DPS as you're not going to be getting headshots as consistently as you would be because the enemy is constantly falling over. The Parasol finishers are a cool addition, but it's too inconsistent to make a difference, at least in my opinion, but I'm going to take what I can get. Slash procs have pretty much stayed the same. The more slash procs that you apply to an enemy, the more damage that you're going to deal overall. The only change that was made is that they don't go through shields anymore, meaning that they're going to affect the shield before affecting the health. They still go through armor, but they don't go through shields. Moving on to our singular elements, we're going to start off with heat. For the rest of the video, I'm going to be using the Warframe with mods to boost up the weapon status chance and the 60/60 mods of the elements that I'm demonstrating. When an enemy is affected by a heat proc, 50% of the base damage is dealt in the form of heat damage per second for a total of 6 seconds, while also causing the enemy to panic for 4 seconds while also stripping up to 50% armor. You can't strip away all of the enemy's armor using heat procs, only half of it. Heat procs also stack indefinitely because of the damage over time, just like slash, so heat is one of the better status effects that you can use now. Moving on to cool procs, they're going to reduce the movement speed, fire rate, and attack speed of the inflicted enemy by 25% for 6 seconds. It can stack up to 10 times with subsequent procs, increasing the slow effect by 5%, leading to a total of a 70% slow at 10 procs. If you think about it, cool procs are kinda just like puncture procs. They reduce the amount of damage that an enemy can deal, but they also have the added benefit of slightly crowd controlling the enemy as well. To achieve the maximum effectiveness from cool procs, you have to constantly keep reapplying the proc to the enemy, so for weapons that have a status chance on the lower end, this proc can seem pretty redundant. Moving on to the electric procs, an enemy inflicted by one will have 50% of the base damage dealt in the form of electric damage. Enemies within 3 meters of the proc target will have this applied to them as well. It's also going to stun them, but only last for 3 seconds. Depending on the enemy that you're playing against, electric procs can be alright. I'd primarily be using electric procs versus corpus enemies, however there are better options. Take Toxin for example, as it's going to deal damage directly to shield the enemy's health through their shields. Speaking of Toxin procs, they deal 50% of the base damage as Toxin damage per second over 6 seconds while also bypassing shields if they're present like we mentioned. For singular elements, Toxin damage and heat damage happen to be my favorites. Now we're moving on to our elemental combinations, the first of which is Blast. Blast no longer knocks enemies over, but instead reduces the enemy's accuracy by 30% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 10 times, 5% a time, leading to a total of a 75% reduction in enemy accuracy. Again, not the best in the world. It relies on you constantly proccing the blast proc to achieve the benefit of the reduced enemy accuracy. It does just sound like a different take on the puncture proc if you think about it, because it makes it so that the enemy has a harder time killing you. Next up, we've got the most used elemental combo in the game, Corrosive. It was changed so it no longer can strip away 100% of the enemy's armor, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on what you're doing. Now corrosive damage is going to reduce afflicted enemies' armor by 26% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 10 times, 6% extra reduced armor per stack, leaving you with a total reduction of 80% armor. Because the enemy's armor can't be completely removed, it means that when you're shooting an armored enemy with a weapon that's modded for corrosive damage, it's going to deal more consistent damage instead of potentially doing more or less damage when the enemy's armor is completely stripped away by your corrosive procs. Now this isn't as big of a deal as it seems, reason being is because they've changed how enemy armor scaling works so that the enemies with armor are a lot easier to kill now compared to previous updates. In doing so, they've sort of made every enemy relatively squishy if you're building your weapons even half right, but that's a topic for a different video. Next we're going to be talking about gas damage. Gas damage used to be really good, but now it sucks simply because they've made it so that the gas cloud no longer applies a toxin damage over time to enemies, but instead a gas damage over time. This is bad because there aren't a lot of enemies in the game that take bonus damage from gas damage, and it doesn't attack the enemy's health directly through shields either. In the most recent update, they tried to buff it up a bit by increasing the range and making the gas cloud remain after the enemy was killed, but it's not exactly enough to make it a viable elemental combo, at least in my opinion. I hope that they eventually revert the change and make it so that the gas cloud procs toxin procs again, just to make gas viable again. They probably won't do it, but here's hoping. If you want to know about the specifics of gas, it deals 50% of the base damage as gas damage per second over 6 seconds with a 3 meter radius. That of course now expands as you proc more and more gas procs. Next up, we have magnetic procs. They surprisingly managed to make magnetic a bit better. It's still a niche elemental combo, however the status effect isn't that bad anymore because of the shield gating changes. Again, that's another topic for another video. Magnetic procs now amplifies the damage that you deal to an enemy's shield by 100% and nullifies their shield regeneration for 6 seconds. It can stack up to 10 times with each proc increasing the damage done to shields, leading to a total of 325%. Again, like I said, it's a niche pick. I'd only really use it in the Orb Vallis when fighting the orb enemies that can spawn in. Other than that, I probably wouldn't use magnetic that much. Moving on to radiation, it still works the same, it just has an extra bonus applied to it. So whenever an enemy is affected by a radiation proc, they will attack the enemy that is closest to them and deal 100% bonus damage to said enemy for 12 seconds. This proc will stack up to 10 times. Additional procs will increase the damage dealt by 50% a time, leading to a total of 550% bonus damage. For me personally, I only ever choose radiation damage to deal 75% bonus damage to certain enemies while using certain weapons such as the Lenka for example, so the status effect never really meant anything to me, and to be honest, it still doesn't unless I'm applying it with Loki's Irradiating Disarm augment for example. Last but definitely not least, we've got Viral. Viral is basically the new meta. It no longer reduces the enemy's health by 50% for a certain amount of time, it instead allows you to deal bonus damage to an enemy's health. Let me read the description for you. When an enemy is inflicted by a viral proc, damage dealt to the enemy's health will be amplified by 100% for 6 seconds. This effect stacks up to 10 times with additional procs increasing the damage to health by 25% a time, leading to a total of 325% additional damage to health. When you take into consideration that slash procs will still go through an enemy's armor and deal damage directly to their health, combining slash procs with viral procs is an insane combo. If you wanted, you could throw heat procs into the mix to reduce said enemy's armor by 50%, meaning you'll deal more damage with each shot. So now with all of that knowledge, you should be able to go ahead and put together your own devastating builds to conquer most of the content within the game. But if you didn't understand a single word that I just said, then I went ahead and put together a build for you guys that you can run on pretty much any crit rifle to deal some crazy damage. It's quite an expensive build, but if you want the maximum amount of damage versus armored and shielded enemies, then this is the build for you. We've got Serration and Split Chamber for our damage and multi-shot, Vital Sense and Point Strike for our critical damage and chance, Hunt Munitions to constantly be applying slash procs to our enemies, Malignant Force and Rhyme Rounds to increase our weapon status chance and give it viral damage. Then last but not least, we have our Flex slot. I like to run a Prime Beam mod in here so I can double dip on the damage that is being dealt by my slash procs, but if you wanted to run something like Bladed Rounds or Thermite Rounds for example, that's entirely okay as well. Of course, not every single weapon in the game will be able to use this build. This build is primarily used on popular weapons such as the Tiburon Prime, Sybaris Prime, and Baza Prime, for example. Viral isn't always going to be the best choice as well. If your weapon has a relatively low status chance, then maybe running Corrosive is the better option because stripping away a certain percentage of armor with the Corrosive procs that you are going to be getting is probably going to be more beneficial than hoping for a viral proc to come into effect so then your slash procs can deal damage to the enemy's health through their armor or whatever the case may be. If you wanted to build your rifle primarily for status, then you'd run Serration, Split Chamber, two 90% elemental mods that correlate with the status type you want to inflict the most. In this case, I want to proc Corrosive more than I want to proc Heat, so I threw on Infected Clip and Stormbringer, free 60-60 status chance mods, so I'm using Malignant Force, High Voltage, and Thermite Rounds. Then your final slot is a Flex slot again, where you can run whatever you want, be it a Beam mod, an extra elemental mod, Vigilante Armaments, pretty much whatever you want. But with all that being said, you should now have at least a very basic understanding on how the new status effects work and how they'll affect your builds and your gameplay. If you enjoyed the video or learned something new, it would help out a lot if you hit like and also subscribed. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.